Issue 3 revived the Madmen as mercenaries, and naturally over-the-top cuckoo for Cocoa Puff ones, hired out by Flash villain Dr. Alchemy to distract the Blue Beetle while he went and stole Promethium, that material I talked about briefly way back in the Teen Titans retrospective. Ah, the joys of a shared universe. Issues 5 through 7 reunite the Blue Beetle and the Question in a less than impressive story about a gang war. One gang in particular is being protected by Big M, aka the Muse. This is a weird remake of West Side Story. Hell, there's even a gang called the Highbrows who all dress like businessmen. And yet not a one of them reviews art movies. Nothing makes sense anymore. The Muse himself turns out to be a mafia boss's son who just wanted to put his dad out of business so he could be an actor. And somehow his death causes all the gangs to stop fighting and clap for each other. It is simultaneously stupid and laughable in its absurdity. Speaking of, issue 8 showed us the Calculator. Yes, seriously. Believe it or not, this guy would actually become a major threat in the 2000s. Basically a villain counterpoint to Oracle, an expert hacker and information expert who would even lead the secret society of supervillains for a while. And here he is, flying around on 2 waffle irons, projecting hard light holograms out of his head while tapping on a numeric keypad on his chest. Issues 9 and 10 are tie-in issues to DC's crossover event at the time, Legends. After the success of Crisis, DC started doing more and more events. Legends is a more low-key one after the hugeness of Crisis, and it's not terrible, but I'll get into it more in a minute. In the meantime, though, issues 11 through 13 are a crossover with the new Teen Titans. Yeah, some villains I don't recall mentioning in the retrospective were the Hybrid, a group of mutated people created at the behest of Beast Boy's adoptive father, Mento, aka Mento of the Doom Patrol. Long story short, he went crazy and turned evil for a while. As you do. Fortunately, in the Titans, they eventually fixed him up, but this is before that point. The end result is one of Ted's friends at Cord Industries getting covered up in Promethium and becoming Prometheus. But hey, this is nothing like the X-Men. They're just a team of mutated people with extraordinary abilities led by a guy in a wheelchair who has incredible mental powers. Huh. The next few issues bring things to a head with Fisher, to the point where, due to a slip of the tongue, Fisher discovers that Ted is the Blue Beetle. He decides that instead of exposing him, especially since he knows that he didn't kill Dan Garrett, he'd put him to use, getting help with criminals who were let off on technicalities get put behind bars. However, while issue 17 introduces that dynamic, it also brings back our old pal. The real Dan Garrett wakes up on Pago Island thanks to the Scarab, and like the android from before, he's pissed. And you know it's really him because his costume has changed again, now with a red beetle thing incorporated into his pants. Oh hey, they did create a Scarlet Beetle. During their fight, a big one at that, Ted manages to slap the Scarab away from Dan and take hold of it, revealing an armored figure who offers the Scarab's power to him. Ted is tempted by it, but realizes that the Scarab is some kind of parasite, using humans to do its will, and is responsible for driving Dan into this madness. A plot point from the next issue manages to awaken Dan's memories of who he is and what he stood for, and he tries to fight the Scarab's mental power over him. The Resistance manages to shatter the Scarab, but the fight kills Dan. Again. If he comes back to life again, I think we can add Super Resurrection to Dan's list of powers. Issues 20 and 21 are tie-ins to yet another event, Millennium, which you will recall as the event that gave us the new Guardians. It's really not all that important. The only thing to focus on here is how, well, Ted's life kind of falls apart, as it does when you're a superhero with a secret identity. And in this case, Melody starts falling for some other guy, Cord Industries has issues due to Ted not being around to fix it, etc. Unfortunately, the final issue does not end on a happy note. Melody calls in Ted's father to take back the company, and an attack by a supervillain from earlier issues wrecks the place up. However, it turns out the guy Melody had eyes for was married, and Ted's dad has no idea how to fix up all the damage to the company. And Ted, deciding to be a dick, walks away from all of it even when people admit they were wrong. It's just such an asshole way to end things in the solo book, especially since there were a few other plot points that were never resolved in it. And as far as I know, they were never resolved elsewhere either. Good job pissing off the people who paid money for this stuff, DC! I know, books get canceled sometimes, but you'd think they'd give the writers enough time to resolve stuff, let it be a complete story. But hey, we're certainly not done with Ted. Let's go back a bit to Legends. Darkseid, in his continuing quest to conquer Earth, hits upon the idea of turning civilian populations against their heroes. He sends his minion Glorious Godfrey to Earth, posing as a lecturer who claims that superheroes cause supervillainy and end up creating more problems than they stop. He's basically a very skilled hypnotist, so it's easy for him to turn people on the heroes thanks to appearing on TV and the like. And this is why the true enemy of our time is talk shows. A few things resulted from this, including the modern concept of the Suicide Squad, aka the government recruits supervillains into a team to do their dirty work for them. Because nothing bad could result from that plan. But the big thing that came out of it was the foundation of a new Justice League. More or less, the Justice League for a bit had lost its spark, the long-running satellite era of the team having been replaced by a team not so affectionately referred to as Justice League Detroit. Gone were most of the heavy hitters and instead replaced with new, hip teenagers, ostensibly to compete with the new Teen Titans and the X-Men. It ended in disaster, but here a new Justice League was formed by Dr. Fate to combat Godfrey and Darkseid's forces that come into play. Godfrey even tries to get his mob to overthrow the government and assassinate President Reagan, resulting in this somewhat infamous panel that you may have seen where someone tries to shoot Reagan in the stomach, only to just reveal his manly abs. What idiots. Let's see you try to impress Jodie Foster now, assholes! In reality, it was the Martian Manhunter in disguise, but it's classic. Anyway, I could go on even longer about Legends, but like I said, the important thing to come out of this was a new Justice League. It's here where the character the Blue Beetle was really defined for several years or so. Namely, as comic relief. It was an interpretation of the character that Len Wein hated, thinking that it turned him into a buffoon. Sure, the Blue Beetle wasn't the greatest hero around, but he felt that it was an asshole thing to do to take someone who was respected and turn them into a joke. Still, Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis, who took on this role, thought of him more as a perfect partner to Ted Kord's new best friend, Booster Gold.
Booster Gold, protecting his past to ensure your future.
Booster Gold, a then-new character created by Dan Jurgens, embodied a superhero for the 80s. Yes, he wanted to help people, but he was perfectly happy to make a buck while he did it. He came from the 25th century, and his equipment was all stuff he had stolen from a superhero museum that he put into a single costume in the hopes of making a new life for himself here. Because nothing says comedy foil as much as loser thief from the future seeking glory and money from people who have been dead for centuries. The book didn't actually start out as a comedy. It's just a lot of banter and joking tended to result as it started, and over time it lent itself to more comedy. Even Batman cracks a joke in issue 3 by making a Star Trek reference. Star Trek reference. Bulbasaur, I can't help but feel I'm forgetting something. And that's where, unfortunately, another figure enters the picture. Maxwell Lord, an entrepreneur and businessman who presents himself to the public as the representative and manager of the League. The problem is that Batman, not wanting to be much of a public figure himself, is leading the League in these early days, and since he doesn't talk to the press, no one makes any effort to distance themselves from Lord, to the point where he eventually does co-opt control of the League away. Mostly because he also has some business connections around the world. Said connections allow him to get the Justice League international support from the United Nations, resulting in the creation of not only the Justice League International, but a second Justice League team operating out of Europe. Originally, Max was just a very ambitious man who had stumbled upon a computer database on Earth left by Metron, one of the new gods. And like Darkseid, Metron truly appreciated the power of a comfy chair. The computer had achieved sapience and convinced Max about all the possibilities for power and glory that it could help him achieve, and he bought into it. However, over time, and a near-fatal shooting during that whole Millennium event, Max grew to like humanity and wanted to actually help it. So he destroys the computer, even though the repairing of that near-death shooting was tied into it. In the wake of that, the Martian Manhunter scans his mind and declares him completely trustworthy, even handing over a Justice League signal device to him. Well, isn't that just peachy and wonderful for Maxwell Lord? And I sure hope there isn't some kind of retcon that screws that up. Unfortunately, I really hate to say it, but much as the Justice League International stuff is beloved by many readers, I'm inclined to agree with Len Wein about Ted's depiction in this stuff. In his solo series, Ted was far from perfect, but he was very much a hero and willing to get into dangerous situations as the need arose. He would banter, of course, but in Justice League International, especially during the initial series, he acted a bit cowardly. When confronted with a dangerous situation, he would need to be prodded into service by Batman or the like to actually do it instead of volunteering to help his friends or help save people. A lot of the humor of JLI does work in moderation. For example, during a brief membership drive, they recruit Hawkman and Hawkwoman into the League. Hawkman is against joining because the image of the League is of a disorganized joke, caring more about goofing around than fighting threats to the world. Batman's reaction? Lighten up a little, will you? My God, you're positively grim. You know, Hawkman, it takes less muscles to smile than to frown. Or, of course, the thing that I will never get tired of referencing, the visual gag of Darkseid sitting in a home furniture display and reading Mein Kampf. I don't know why this was chosen for my book club. The editing on this is terrible. But for every great gag like that, you've got serious, life-threatening situations where characters are making pop culture references or preferring to tell jokes instead of, you know, getting on with it! Humor is a way to diffuse tension, yes, but when characters refuse to even admit the tension is going on, it's just annoying and distracting. What's actually even more distracting about these first few years' worth of issues, for all the flack Booster Gold gets for being a money-grubbing sellout, I actually found Ted during all of this to be the one coming up with schemes, not recognizing when his behavior was inappropriate, falling asleep during monitor duty, shrugging off the tragedy of a unique being's suicide, and just generally being an asshat. For example, there's an infamous one that people like to cite where Blue Beetle and Booster Gold set up an island resort and casino on a tropical island that turns out to be alive. And of course, it is all Ted's idea. Keith Giffen said that Blue Beetle was just so derivative a character and the name itself so silly that you couldn't take him seriously. Well, it's hard to take someone seriously when you turn them into a joke! Not to say that every single issue during this run was all smiles and goofing off, but even the super serious stuff has problems with it. When longtime enemy of the Justice League, Despero, comes in on a killing spree, seemingly killing Mr. Miracle, Ted wants to be left alone in his grief and is kind of a prick to another teammate, Ice, about it. Oh, and as an aside, Blue Beetle is too ridiculous a name, but Mr. Miracle isn't? Things don't get any better for Ted when they start a storyline about him getting overweight. Not surprising, considering the majority of crime fighting that he ended up doing involved sitting on his ass. In a 15-part, yes, seriously, crossover with Justice League Europe, the original UN-backed Justice League International is shut down, and the team simply becomes the Justice League of America again, which it would be until its run ended. Shortly after breakdowns, Dan Jurgens took over writing the book, and things were back on track. Ted could still be snarky, but at least he demonstrated that he was intelligent and dedicated to heroing. In fact, he was so dedicated, he was one of the first to take on Doomsday, and wound up in a coma for his troubles, while at the same time, Superman was killed. After Dan Jurgens concluded his run, Ted was back in action more for his scientific side, doing more work reinventing not only Booster Gold's suit, but also serving as the team's resident smart person. However, things came to a head after about 90+ issues of the book. Long story short, the previously mentioned Ice was killed in battle. The incident split the League just as Justice League Europe came to an end. Because of the negative media coverage the team was getting, Ted chose to speak out in Ice's defense, and further still, joined Captain Atom's new Justice League team that he was forming. That book was also complete and utter 90s garbage, operating under the title Extreme Justice. And remember, kids, together we can be extreme! To be fair, they did not call themselves Extreme Justice. It was just the awful, awful name of the book. I'd like to say they should have known better. The book came out in 1995 when a lot of the 90s overuse of the phrase was starting to die off. But the first issue premiered in January of '95, so they were probably still approaching it with that kind of 90s mindset. It is an awful book, by the way. Terrible 90s artwork with confusing, boring plots about government conspiracies and the first attempt to reconcile the Captain Atom was supposed to be monarch thing I've talked about a few times before. Once again providing evidence to my grand unified theory about bad comics. Every terrible comic can be in some way linked to Countdown. Ted once again continued his role as the team's smart person, though he was more assertive about being actively combating threats. The more interesting thing about him was the art. He's truly at his most Spider-Man-like in this artwork, always hopping around, clinging to things, contorting himself in bizarre manners. Hell, they even made his goggles bigger as if to resemble Spider-Man's. The Blue Beetle, ripping off other characters since 1939. Extreme Justice ended without even a proper finale before it led into the Grant Morrison JLA book, and probably for the best. But of course, Blue Beetle wasn't down for very long. In 1999, he and all the other Charlton heroes were brought together for a mini-series called Law. LAW was an acronym for Living Assault Weapons, which was really the only stupid 90s thing about it. Created by Dick Giordano and Bob Layton, another former Charlton staffer, it was an admitted attempt to bring the Blue Beetle back from being, in Layton's own words, a laughable buffoon. To be fair though, as much as I disliked how he was in Justice League International, he had gotten away from that even in Extreme Justice, so I don't think it was really that necessary. The miniseries is nothing to write home about, but it does establish that Ted has been working the last few years on recreating Cord Industries and building up its technology level. It is enjoyable to see another team of competent heroes dealing with a huge problem and not needing to worry about the JLA taking charge. Also, fortunately, they do not refer to themselves as the Sentinels of Justice. Ted also says at the end that he's taking a break from being the Blue Beetle for a while, admitting that his more jokey attitude during the JLI days was a result of the issues related to what happened with Dan Garrett, and also just wanting his life back away from superheroing. Ted next joined up as a supporting cast member to Birds of Prey, meeting up with Barbara Gordon, aka Oracle, at a tech conference, and both quickly figure out who the other is. Chuck Dixon, who was writing Birds of Prey and Nightwing at the time, actually had a bizarre but interesting idea for the legacy of the Blue Beetle. He wanted Tim Drake, the third Robin, to become the new Blue Beetle, with Ted mentoring him for a 6-issue miniseries before he then went back to being Robin. And that would lead into a new monthly for Ted, where he trained a team of Blue Beetles. I'm kinda iffy on the multiple Blue Beetles thing, but Tim becoming the Blue Beetle is a pretty cool idea to me. And hey, Tim can have yet another superhero identity on top of the others he's already collected. What is it with the Bat characters having multiple identities? Ted became a more active agent and assistant to the Birds of Prey for a while, until issue 39, where it was revealed Ted actually has a degenerative heart disease. What's more, he's actually had 3 minor heart attacks that he didn't know about. As a result of this and the changing creative team of the book, Ted was phased out. He had 2 more things that we're not going to cover. Formerly known as the Justice League, and I Can't Believe It's Not the Justice League. Humorous stories by Keith Giffen and Jam DeMatteis that basically were modern-day reunions of the JLI crew. They're harmless fun, except for one point. See, in the case of I Can't Believe, we have circumstances of the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing, because it's a humorous story that ended up being released after the end of Ted Kord and the revelations that came with his end. And thus we come to the conclusion of our story of Ted Kord, Countdown to Infinite Crisis. Countdown to Infinite Crisis is a book that absolutely infuriates me, mostly because I like it so much when I really shouldn't. It's written by Jeff Johns and, as the name says, begins the build-up of DC's sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis. The plot revolves around Ted Kord narrating to himself as he investigates a series of occurrences that spell out a larger conspiracy in the DCU. No one believes his warnings, and at worst, they treat his concerns as being overly paranoid or that he's just a joke not worthy of anybody's time. His life falls apart, again, as funds from Cord Industries are siphoned off, his holdings are liquidated, and he's even attacked by the Madmen and by a mysterious energy beam from above, which puts Booster Gold in the hospital when he offers to help. What's more, despite us having seen the Blue Beetle scarab destroyed back in his solo series, Ted reveals that Hawkman had discovered it again in an Egyptian tomb and given it to him. Ted was very tempted to use it, even with what happened before with it, but instead it leads him to the wizard Shazam, who takes the scarab from him. Ted eventually tracks things down to a castle in the Swiss Alps. No one returns his calls for help, so he goes in alone and discovers the true mastermind behind all this. Maxwell Lord. Max reveals that his conspiracy is all about superhumans, namely that they can't be trusted and eventually they will turn on everybody else. And given events at the time, including the series Identity Crisis, which I did a video on a few years ago, it's not hard to see his point. However, given everything that Max has done to this point, it's clearly also a bid for world domination. What's more, he says this has always been his objective, that he deliberately kept the Justice League ineffectual for years with his own metahuman powers. Ted makes a valiant effort to escape, but is captured again by Max. Max offers him the chance to join him, and Steve Ditko would be proud of Ted's uncompromising response, telling Max to rot in hell. Ted Kord's life comes to an end in a gory, gratuitous fashion as Maxwell Lord murders him. Because heaven forbid we see our hero, the main character of the story who we've followed from beginning to end here, without parts of him splattered across the panel and his death face staring up at us. One of Geoff Johns' problems as a writer is his approach to drama. He wants to create pathos for his characters, and he's very good at writing that pathos. The problem is that sometimes he plays fast and loose with continuity in order to create that pathos. Just an example away from this. Power Girl. Everybody jokes about the boob hole in her costume, but as written at the time, it was just a reflection of her personality. And I have nothing to hide, so if you want to demean yourself by making a big deal out of it, go ahead attitude. We could certainly debate how much of that is creator justifying sexist design choices versus characters should be allowed to do some ridiculous things despite oversaturation of those choices, but in the end, that was her design, and that was the reason for it. Geoff Johns changed it to, I left it open because I didn't have my own symbol like Superman, and it's representing a hole in my heart. That's an oversimplification, but it's what it comes down to. It's a very well-written scene with legitimate sadness and emotion, except it's a blatant retcon and spits in the face of what we know about the character. And therein lies the problem with Countdown to Infinite Crisis. It's very well written. It makes you feel for Ted Kord like never before and demonstrates why he's such a damn awesome hero and deserves respect. But in order to do that, it needs us to completely forget everything that came before, to make all these characters think of him in a way that is completely contradictory to what we know. Now, to be fair, we see all of this from Ted's point of view, so he might be an unreliable narrator here, that what he reads as disinterest or frustration with him isn't the case, but that's not how it's presented, and there's very little evidence after the comic to line up with any interpretation except that. Behaviors of the characters feel off for no good reason. It had been years since the days of Ted doing get-rich-quick schemes. Dude had a heart condition and swore not to wear the costume again. Never mentioned during this, by the way. And people who knew him and trusted him for years shrug him off as a loser or give a pat, keep me informed. Maxwell Lord being the villain is the same way. We have seen his personal thoughts during the JLI days. Thought balloons existed for a reason. He wasn't some grand mastermind trying to screw over the League and be paranoid of superhumans or the like. We saw him discovering his powers for the first time. We saw his personal torments and feelings on things, particularly how much he cared for the League. And yet, as a result of Ted having to stand alone, of having everyone abandon him during all of this, and seeing his struggle and conflicts and emotions, it's so damn good! It's so frustrating! In the end, the life and death of Ted Kord were focused around a single thing: his humanity. Unlike the ever-confident, nigh-invincible Dan Garrett, Ted had to use his head and his heart to be a hero. Through all the good times and the bad, even when he questioned himself for the legacy he embraced, let it never be said that Ted was not a hero, even when he was having a good chuckle alongside Booster Gold. Next time, blue skying continues with the fallout of Ted's death, what it meant to the DC Universe, and the birth of the third and final Blue Beetle, Jaime Reyes. Now you shouldn't go around hitting people from behind. Holy crap, Ted Kord already learns from the mistakes of Dan Garrett and doesn't receive multiple concussions!